The storm had torn through the hollow wood like something with teeth, and by morning the forest looked as though a giant hand had raked through it and left the wreckage to dry in the pale autumn sun. Branches lay scattered across the deer paths. An ancient oak near the eastern ridge had cracked clean through its trunk, its crown collapsing into the underbrush in a tangle of split wood and stripped leaves. Alpha King Roan Ashvale rode through it alone, which his counselor would have scolded him for, had Counselor Hale been awake to notice. Roan had left before dawn, before the castle stirred, because he could not stand one more morning of being looked at the way his court had taken to looking at him lately, as though he were a ledger that needed balancing, a debt that had gone too long unpaid. The debt, as Hale liked to remind him, was a queen. 3 years he had worn the crown. 3 years since his father's heart had given out in the middle of a council session, and the weight of Veremore had dropped onto Roan's shoulders without warning or ceremony. He had learned to carry it. He had learned the borders, the treaties, the grain reports, the names of every village headman from the coast to the mountains. What he had not done, what he had refused, gently and then less gently, for 3 years, was choose a mate. The southern kingdoms wanted an alliance sealed in blood and bonding. Hale wanted stability. The court wanted a coronation to gossip about. And Roan wanted, more than anything that morning, simply to be somewhere no one wanted anything from him at all. So he rode into the wreckage of the hollow wood, with no guard and no destination, his horse picking carefully over downed limbs, and he let the cold air do what 3 years of council meetings could not, clear his head. That was when he heard it. A sound so small he almost mistook it for the wind dragging through broken branches, a voice, thin and rasping, repeating the same 2 words over and over like a prayer worn smooth from use. Please, please, he reined in. Listened, the sound came again, from somewhere past the fallen oak, low to the ground, and underneath it, fainter, the unmistakable, bone-deep ache of an Omega's distress scent, sharp with fear and exhaustion, carried to him on the wind before he even understood what he was smelling. Roan was off his horse before he'd finished the thought. He found her half buried in the oak's collapsed crown, where the storm had pinned a heavy limb across the ground and the smaller branches had folded in around her, like the bars of a cage built by accident. Her wrist was caught. Not broken, he saw with relief, but wedged between 2 branches that had splintered and crossed when the tree fell, the wood pressing tight enough that her hand had gone pale and her fingers had stopped moving properly hours ago, by the look of it. She was small. That was his first real thought, once the alarm of Omega in distress gave way to actually seeing her, small and thin in a way that had nothing to do with delicacy and everything to do with not having eaten enough for longer than was good for anyone. Her dress had been a servant's dress once. Brown wool gone gray with dirt and rain, torn along one shoulder. Her hair, dark and matted with leaves, had come half loose from its braid and stuck to her face, which was turned away from him, pressed against the wet ground. Please, she said again, to the dirt, to the branches, to no one. Please, just please, I have to, easy. Roan kept his voice low, the way he might for a spooked animal, and dropped to his knees a careful distance away. You're not alone anymore. Don't pull against it. You'll only tear the wrist worse. She went rigid, her head came up, and for the first time he saw her face, and the fear in it hit him like a physical blow. An old, deep, practiced fear. The kind that lived in a person's bones long before any particular threat arrived to justify it. Her eyes were a clear hazel green, red-rimmed from crying, and they fixed on him with the flat, calculating terror of someone doing rapid arithmetic about how badly this was about to go. I'm not, her voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again, and this time there was something brittle and rehearsed in it, like a line memorized for exactly this moment. I'm not unclaimed. I belong to someone. You should leave me be. Sir, please. I'm not available. It took him a moment to understand what she meant, and when he did, something in his chest went cold and then, just as quickly, hot. She thought he'd come to claim her. An unbonded Omega, alone in the woods, found by an unmated Alpha, by law, by the oldest and ugliest of Veremore's old laws. That was an invitation, if the Alpha chose to make it one. Most kingdoms had reformed the practice generations ago. Most, not all. And clearly, wherever this girl had come from, the practice hadn't just survived, it had taught her to flinch. I'm not here to claim anything, Roan said, and made himself say it slowly, clearly, the way he'd say it to a council that needed convincing. I heard someone in trouble. That's all. I want to get your hand free before it does any more damage. That's the whole of it. Nothing else. Do you understand? She stared at him, Her chest was heaving, short, fast breaths, and he could see her trying to decide whether to believe him. Could see, with a kind of helpless ache, that belief was not a thing that came easily to her anymore. Her gaze dropped, taking in the cut of his coat, the sigil at his collar, the silver wolf's head of Vairmore, which every child in the kingdom could recognize by the time they could walk. Her face went, if possible, even paler. "You're the king." "I am," he admitted. "And right now I'd very much like to be a man with 2 free hands and a knife, instead. May I?" It took longer than he'd hoped to free her. The branches had settled with their full weight against each other, and every shift sent a fresh jolt of pain across her face that she tried, with visible effort, not to show him. He worked the smaller limbs loose first, bracing the larger one with his shoulder so it wouldn't settle further, and talked the whole time, low and even. About nothing in particular. The storm, the state of the road, the stubbornness of old oak wood. Because he had the sense that the sound of a calm voice mattered more, just then, than anything he actually said. When her wrist finally slid free, she gasped and curled it against her chest, and Roan sat back on his heels and let her have a moment before he said anything else. "What's your name?" A long pause. "Ren. Ren." He said it carefully, as though testing whether it would hold weight. That's a fitting name for someone the storm tried to keep. She didn't answer that. She was looking at her wrist, flexing the fingers slowly, wincing, and Roan used the silence to actually look at her properly, at the bruising along her jaw that was a few days old, yellow-green at the edges, at the way her bare feet, when he glanced down, were cut and filthy, as though she'd been walking a long way without shoes, at the collar of her dress, where someone had cut away a strip of fabric so recently the threads were still loose, as if removing something stitched there. A name mark, perhaps, a household sigil. "Where did you come from, Ren?" She flinched at the question the way she'd flinched at his presence, and Roan understood, with a sinking feeling, that this was not a story that was going to be simple. "Drennick Hall," she said finally, so quietly he had to lean in to catch it. "Lord Dremmond's house. I'm indentured there. I ran." "Why?" Her jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer, and he wouldn't have blamed her. He was, after all, still a stranger, even if he was no longer a threat. But something about the question, or the way he asked it, or simply the exhaustion of having held the answer in alone for however many hours she'd been trapped here, broke something loose in her. "His son," she said, "Gareth. He's been saying for months he means to claim me, properly with the rights. Whether I agree or not, because I'm indentured, because no one would stop him, because my contract says I belong to the household and he's part of the household. So what's the difference?" he said. Her voice had gone flat, reciting it. 2 nights ago he tried. I got away. I ran into the wood during the storm because I thought no one would follow me into that. And then the tree came down. And I couldn't. She stopped, pressed her lips together hard, and Roan understood she was holding back tears with the kind of effort that only comes from years of practice at not being allowed to cry where anyone could see. Roan sat very still for a moment, because if he moved just then, he was fairly sure it would be to ride to Drennick Hall and have a conversation with Lord Dremmond's son that would end with the boy needing new teeth. Instead, he said, "You're not going back there." Ren looked up at him, startled, and he saw the flicker of "not yet, don't hope yet" cross her face before she could stop it. "I have nowhere else." "You have the castle," Roan said. "At least until your wrist heals and you've had a meal that isn't whatever you've been surviving on out here." After that, he shrugged, as though it were the simplest thing in the world, though he suspected, even as he said it, that it would turn out to be anything but. "After that, we'll work out the rest." Counselor Hale met them at the gate, because Counselor Hale always seemed to know precisely when his king was about to do something that would require careful explaining to the rest of the court, and had developed an uncanny instinct for intercepting him before he got too far. "You went out alone," Hale said, by way of greeting, and then his gaze slid past Roan to the woman riding in front of him on the saddle, wrapped in the king's own riding cloak, and his eyebrows went up by a careful, diplomatic degree. "And you came back with company." "Ren," Roan said. "She was injured in the storm. She'll need the healer, a room, and food in that order." He swung down from the horse and lifted Ren down himself before any of the stable hands could think to do it. She was so light it barely registered his effort, and he noticed, with a small private wince, the way she went still and braced when his hands closed around her, the way a person braces for a blow that doesn't come. Hale's eyes moved over her, the torn dress, the cutaway collar, the bruises, And Roan watched the older man do the same arithmetic Ren herself had done in the woods, only from the opposite direction. Indentured Omega. Cut sigil. No papers. Hale had been counselor for 30 years. Very little escaped him. Roan, Hale's voice dropped, pitched for the king alone, though Roan suspected, heard every word of it anyway. Omega's tended to. A word. Privately, whatever you want to say, you can say in front of her. Fine. Hale's mouth thinned. She's indentured. That collar wasn't cut off for decoration. Someone removed a household mark. Which means either she ran or she was taken, and either way, whoever holds that contract has a legal claim that doesn't simply evaporate because she crossed into Vermore's borders. If it's Drennick land she came from, it is. Then Lord Dremmond is going to come asking for his property back, and when he does, you are going to have a choice between handing over a girl who is clearly fleeing something terrible, or starting a dispute with one of the wealthiest holdings on our southern border, 3 months before the Southern Alliance talks are meant to begin. Hale exhaled. I am not telling you to turn her out. I am telling you that kindness, in this case, may have a price, and you should know the size of it before you decide you're willing to pay it. Roan looked at Ren. She had gone very still, listening, her chin lifted in a way that he was beginning to suspect was less pride than the simple, exhausted readiness of someone bracing to be handed back. I know the size of it, Roan said. Healer, room, food, in that order. Hale, we'll discuss the rest when it actually arrives at our gate, and not a moment before. Hale studied him for a long moment. The particular, weighing look he gave Roan whenever he suspected the king was about to do something Hale would spend the next several weeks managing the consequences of. Then he sighed, the sigh of a man who had picked this particular battle many times before, and lost it every time. Mother Yu is in the east wing, he said. I'll send word ahead. Mother Yu took one look at Ren's wrist, declared it badly wrenched but not broken, packed it in a poultice that smelled of comfrey and something sharper underneath, and then, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had clearly seen a great deal in her years as castle healer and had stopped being surprised by any of it, fed Ren a bowl of broth, then bread, then more broth, in careful stages, scolding her gently every time she tried to eat too fast. Slow down, girl, your stomach's forgotten how to do this properly. You'll make yourself sick. Ren slowed down. Roan, who had stayed, ostensibly to make sure the healer had everything she needed, though he suspected everyone in the room knew that wasn't the real reason, watched the color slowly come back into her face as the food and warmth did their work, and felt something in his own chest loosen that he hadn't fully realized had been clenched. It was 3 days before Ren said more than a handful of words to him at a time, and Roan made himself patient about it, because he understood, better than most people in his position ever bothered to, that trust, for someone like her, was not a door you could simply push open. It had to be left unlocked, and then you had to wait, and not look as though you were waiting, until someone on the other side decided it was safe enough to come through on their own. So he didn't press. He visited, briefly, each day, asked after her wrist, asked if Mother Yu's cooking agreed with her, asked nothing that required more than a nod or a word in answer, and let the visits be exactly as short or as long as Ren seemed to want them to be, which in the first days was very short indeed. On the 4th day, he found her sitting up in bed with a book open on her lap, not reading it so much as looking at it, turning pages slowly, studying the illustrations, an old herbal that Mother Yu kept on her shelf for reference. You read? Roan asked, before he could think better of how the question might sound. Ren's shoulders went up, just slightly, the old flinch, the bracing, and then, to his surprise, came back down. A little. The head gardener at Drennick taught me, when I was small. Before, she stopped, the way she always stopped when the sentence was about to lead somewhere she didn't want to go, and then, unexpectedly, kept going anyway. Before my parents died and the debt passed to me, I used to help him in the gardens. He had a whole shelf of books like this. Said a gardener who can't read a planting calendar is just guessing, and guessing kills more plants than frost does. It was the longest thing she'd said to him since the hollow wood, and Roan was careful, so careful, not to make too much of it, not to lean forward too eagerly or ask too many questions at once and send the whole fragile thing skittering back into its shell. What happened to him? The gardener. Sold, eventually. Lord Dremmond doesn't keep anyone past usefulness. She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than if she had, said it the way a person describes weather, an unremarkable fact of the climate they'd grown up in. After that I worked the kitchens. The gardens went to seed. No one else knew how to read the calendars. Roan thought of Vermore's own gardens, the formal beds his mother had once kept, gone slightly wild and overgrown in the busy years since his father's death, because no one currently on staff had the time or the particular knowledge to manage them properly. "We have gardens that could use someone who reads calendars," he said. "If you wanted something to do with your hands, once you're healed. No obligation in it. Just an option, if it would help." Ren looked at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes, and Roan understood, belatedly, that he had just offered her the first thing in longer than he wanted to think about that had been framed as a choice rather than an assignment. "I'd like that," she said, very quietly. "I think I'd like that very much." The gardens, it turned out, suited her in a way that nothing else at the castle seemed to. Roan watched it happen over the following weeks with a kind of quiet astonishment. Watched Ren go from a girl who startled at footsteps and ate with her shoulders curled protectively around her plate, to someone who stood in the overgrown beds with dirt on her hands and an expression of fierce, focused contentment, muttering about root rot and pruning schedules as though she'd been born to it. He found himself visiting more often than gardens, strictly speaking, required a king's attention. "You don't have to keep checking on me," Ren told him one afternoon, not unkindly, as she knelt by a bed of late roses with shears in hand. "I know you've a kingdom to run. I'm hardly going to wilt if you're not here every day to confirm it." "I know." Roan settled onto the low stone wall nearby, where he had, over the past weeks, more or less worn a permanent dent. "I like the gardens." "Is that a crime now?" "You like the gardens," Ren repeated with the particular dryness that he'd discovered, to his quiet delight, she'd had hiding under all that careful watchfulness the whole time. A dryness that came out more and more, now, the longer she felt safe. "You liked the gardens so much you had a chair brought down and placed exactly where I happened to be working, 3 days running." "Coincidence?" She didn't look up from the roses, but he could see the corner of her mouth fighting a smile. "Your counselor doesn't think it's a coincidence. He stopped even pretending to be subtle about glaring at me from the upper windows." Roan's good mood dimmed, slightly. Hale glares at everyone. It's practically a hobby. He's not wrong to worry, though. Ren set down the shears and sat back on her heels, and when she looked at him this time there was none of the dryness left, just a tired, clear-eyed honesty that she'd been working up to, he suspected, for some time. "I've heard the talk, Roan, the servants' gossip, and I'm good at being invisible, years of practice. I know about the Southern Alliance, and the talks about a match, and I know what it looks like. The king spending his afternoons in the garden with an indentured Omega who turned up out of nowhere with no name and no papers. It looks like a problem. For you." It was the first time she'd called him Roan instead of Your Majesty, or, more often, nothing at all, sliding around the question of what to call him entirely, and he noticed it the way he noticed very little else in that moment, because everything else in him had gone very carefully, deliberately calm in the particular way it did right before he said something he'd been avoiding saying. "Do you want to know what I think, when I'm sitting in those alliance talks?" he asked. Ren went still. "What?" "I think about how long it's been since I came back here and felt like I could breathe." He kept his voice light, because if he let it be anything else, he was fairly sure he'd lose his nerve entirely. "And then I realize I'm thinking about whether you've eaten lunch yet, in the middle of a discussion about grain tariffs, and Hale has to repeat the question twice because I haven't heard a word of it." "Roan, I'm not finished." He met her eyes, and made himself hold the look, even though every instinct he had was telling him this was reckless, badly timed, far too soon for someone who flinched at footsteps 3 weeks ago. "I know what it looks like. I know what it is too, Ren. At least, I know what it is for me. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. And I'm not going to make you say anything back, today or any day, until you want to. But I needed you to know. Because you deserve to know what you're choosing, if you choose anything at all, and not find it out secondhand from servants' gossip. Like everything else has happened to you, secondhand, your whole life." For a long moment, Ren said nothing at all. The afternoon light slanted gold through the rose canes, and somewhere across the garden a bird, fittingly, absurdly, a wren, scolded something from a hedge, and Roan waited, his heart going entirely too fast for a man who ruled a kingdom and was, by most accounts, difficult to rattle. "I don't know how to do this," Ren said at last, and her voice was unsteady in a way he hadn't heard from her before, not fear, this time, but something raw. Wanting something, choosing something, and having it be allowed to matter. "I've spent my whole life being something that belonged to people. I don't know what it looks like, to belong to myself first." Then we'll find out together, Roan said. Slowly, however slowly you need. I'm not in any hurry, Ren. I've waited 3 years for something I couldn't even name. I can wait a while longer for something I can. She laughed, a small, wet, startled sound, half a sob, and pressed the back of her dirt-streaked hand to her eyes. That's a very kingly thing to say. I have my moments. The moments did not last, as moments rarely do. Lord Drummond arrived 11 days later, with an escort of 12 riders and a face like a man who had been inconvenienced, and intended to make that inconvenience everyone else's problem in turn. He was received in the great hall with the full, chilly formality that Hale insisted upon for exactly this kind of visit. A formality designed, Roan had come to understand, less to honor the visitor than to remind him, gently and constantly, that he was a guest, and guests could be asked to leave. Your Majesty. Drummond's bow was correct to the precise degree required and not 1 degree more. I've come on a matter of some delicacy. It's come to my attention that a member of my household, an indentured Omega, registered under Drennick Hall, name of Wren, fled my lands some weeks past during the storm. I have reason to believe she may have found her way to Vairmore. His eyes flicked, briefly toward the doors that led to the garden wing, and Roan understood that Drummond already knew exactly where she was, and the entire speech was a formality, the way the cold greeting had been a formality. 2 men performing the steps of a dance whose real conversation would happen underneath the words. And if she has? Roan asked. Then I would ask that she be returned to my custody, as is her contractual obligation, and as is, I'm sure your Majesty will agree, a matter of basic respect between neighboring holdings regarding the sanctity of indenture law. Drummond's smile was thin. I would be sorry to have to raise the matter with the High Council of Alphas. Disputes over indenture rights between kingdoms are, I believe, exactly the sort of thing the Council exists to adjudicate, and exactly the sort of thing that tends to color how a kingdom is regarded going into other negotiations. The Southern Alliance talks, for instance. I understand those are delicate enough already, without additional complications. There it was. Roan had known it was coming. Hale had warned him, in increasingly blunt terms, for over a week, and still it landed like a blow. The casual, surgical precision of it. Drummond wasn't threatening war. He was threatening embarrassment, the kind that would ripple outward through every alliance Vairmore was trying to build, all because its king had sheltered a runaway servant out of, what would the southern courts call it? Sentiment, weakness. A king who couldn't be trusted to honor agreements when honoring them was inconvenient. I'll need to review the original indenture contract, Roan said, keeping his voice level, before anything is decided. Of course. Drummond produced a folded document with the air of a man who had been carrying it for exactly this purpose. All quite in order, Your Majesty. I'm sure you'll find everything as it should be. Wren found out before Roan had a chance to tell her. Of course she did. The castle's servants had eyes and ears everywhere, and half of them had grown fond of her over the past weeks, which meant the news reached the garden wing within the hour, delivered in hushed, worried voices by people who clearly didn't know whether telling her was a kindness or a cruelty. Roan found her in her room that evening, and knew immediately from the careful, contained stillness of her, the stillness he hadn't seen in weeks, the bracing, that she already knew. I won't let him take you, he said before she could say anything at all. You might not have a choice. Wren's voice was steady, terribly steady, the voice of someone who had already done the arithmetic and arrived at an answer she didn't like but had decided to accept anyway, because accepting it herself was easier than watching someone else be forced to. I heard what he said. The Council. The Alliance talks. Roan. I've seen what happens to kingdoms that get a reputation for breaking agreements. Drennick Hall trades with half the southern holdings, and Lord Drummond has cousins on that council. This isn't a fight you can win without it costing you something enormous, and I won't. Her voice wavered, just slightly, before she caught it again. I won't be the reason you lose everything you've spent 3 years building. I won't. Wren, I should go back. She said it fast, like ripping off a bandage, like she'd practiced saying it and was afraid that if she slowed down she wouldn't be able to make herself say it at all. Tonight, before it becomes a formal dispute. If I go back on my own, it's just a servant returning. No council, no scandal, nothing for anyone to point at. You go on with your alliance, and I go back to a household where Drummond's son tried to force a bonding on you 11 days ago, Roan said, and he could hear his own voice shaking now, with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but a furious tangle of both. Wren, no. It's my choice. She looked up at him, and her eyes were wet but her chin was lifted. That same stubborn lift he'd seen the very first day, in the hollow wood, when she'd told a king to leave her alone. You said it yourself, in the garden. You said I deserved to choose. This is me choosing, Roan. I'm choosing this, so that you don't have to. That's not a choice, Roan said, very quietly. That's a sacrifice, and I am not going to let you make it. Not for me, not for some alliance, not for anything. Do you understand me? I would rather burn every treaty in that southern hall to ash than send you back to that house. You don't mean that. I have never meant anything more in my life. But Wren only shook her head, slowly, helplessly, the way a person shakes their head at a kindness they've decided they don't deserve, and Roan understood, with a sick lurch, that she had already made up her mind, and that nothing he said tonight was going to be enough to unmake it. He left her room an hour later, having extracted a promise. You'll wait until morning. You'll let me speak to the Council of Advisors first. You'll give me that much, that he did not, in his heart, entirely trust her to keep. He was right not to. By the time the castle stirred at dawn, Wren was gone. He knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence, exactly where she'd gone. He rode out alone again. Hale would have a great deal to say about that, later, and Roan found he did not care in the slightest, and he didn't slow his horse until the broken silhouette of the hollow wood rose up against the gray morning sky, the storm-felled oak still lying where it had fallen, branches stark and gray against the frost-touched ground. He found her there. Of course he did. Sitting on the same fallen trunk where, weeks ago, he'd knelt to free her wrist, except this time she wasn't trapped by branches. This time, 3 of Dremmond's riders had found her first, and one of them had her by the arm, hauling her toward a waiting horse while she pulled back against his grip with every ounce of strength in her thin frame. And the worst part, the part that made something in Roan's chest go white-hot and roaring, was that she wasn't even fighting to escape toward Veremore. She'd been heading toward Drennickland, on her own, to spare him a fight, and Dremmond's men had simply been waiting along the road to make sure she arrived. Let her go. The words came out of him in a register he didn't entirely recognize as his own, low and carrying, in the particular way an alpha's voice carries when there is nothing behind it but absolute intent. All 3 riders froze. The one holding Wren's arm actually let go, stumbling back a step, before he visibly remembered himself and reached for his sword instead. Your Majesty. The lead rider, older, gray at the temples, with the bearing of a man who'd served Drennick Hall for decades and would rather not be doing this, inclined his head with obvious reluctance. Lord Dremmond's orders. The contract's valid, Majesty. You said yourself you'd review. I reviewed it. Roan dismounted, slowly, deliberately, and crossed the frozen ground to where Wren stood, putting himself, without any particular subtlety, between her and the riders. Behind him, he felt rather than saw her hand close, briefly, convulsively, on the back of his coat. I reviewed it most of the night, in fact. Shall I tell you what I found? The lead rider said nothing. Roan smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Indenture contracts in Veremore, and, I checked, under the Council's own model code, which Drennick Hall is supposedly bound by as a signatory, become void the moment the indentured party is formally claimed and bonded by an alpha of equal or higher standing than the contract holder. Not attempted, not threatened, a completed bonding. Your young Lord Gareth's attempt 11 days ago doesn't void anything, because it failed, but it does establish, on the record, that Drennick Hall has already breached the basic protections the model code requires for indentured Omegas. Which means, gentlemen, that whatever happens here this morning, Lord Dremmond's hands are considerably less clean than he led me to believe, and the Council, should this somehow still end up in front of the Council, is going to have quite a lot to discuss regarding Drennick Hall's compliance, well before anyone gets around to discussing Veremore's. He let that settle. The lead writer's face had gone carefully, studiously blank, the face of a man doing his own rapid arithmetic and not liking the answer any better than Wren had liked hers, weeks ago, in this same clearing. There is, however, Roan continued, a much simpler solution, which I would be obliged if you'd carry back to your lord with my compliments. As of this morning, the Omega known as Wren is under the formal protection and intended bonding of the Alpha King of Veremore. Any contract claim against her is, as of this moment, void. Not eventually, not pending review. Now, immediately, his voice didn't rise, but something underneath it did. Something with teeth. You may tell Lord Dremmond that if he wishes to dispute that before the Council, I will meet him there gladly, with the full record of his son's conduct in hand. Or he may simply accept that he has lost a servant and gained, in exchange, the very great favor of not having that record made public. The choice, as ever, is his. But it is no longer a choice that involves her. For a long, taut moment, nobody moved. Then the lead writer, who Roan suspected had not particularly wanted to be here for any of this, bowed, low and genuinely this time, and gathered his men, and within minutes the sound of hooves was fading back down the southern road, and the hollow wood was quiet again, the way it had been quiet weeks ago, when there had been nothing in it but a girl, and a fallen tree, and a king who'd gone looking for silence, and found something else entirely. Roan turned around. Wren was staring at him, her hand still fisted in the back of his coat, her face doing something complicated between disbelief and a fierce, dawning hope she looked almost afraid to let herself feel. "You said." Her voice came out rough. "You said bonding. Intended bonding. You can't just... Roan, you can't just declare that, in front of them, without... I know." He turned to face her fully and took both her hands in his, carefully the way he'd learned to touch her, slowly enough that she could pull away if she needed to, though she didn't. "I know I can't declare it without you. I didn't. Listen to what I actually said. Intended. It's a claim that buys time, Wren, that's all it is, unless you decide you want it to be more than that. If you don't, if this isn't what you want, not now, not ever, then it stands as a legal fiction for exactly as long as it needs to, and nothing more happens, and you are still free, and still safe, and still entirely your own. That part isn't conditional. That part was never conditional, and if I do want it..." Her voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper, but her eyes hadn't left his, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there in the hollow wood the first time. Something that wasn't fear at all. "If I want it to be more than a legal fiction?" "Then," Roan said, and found, to his own faint surprise, that his own voice wasn't quite steady either, "I would consider it the very great honor of my life. Wren, not the king's life. Mine, the part of me that's just a man, who's been half in love with a gardener since the 4th day she let him sit on a wall and watch her prune roses, and has been trying very hard ever since. Not to make that her problem." Wren laughed, that same wet, startled laugh from the garden, except this time it didn't stop. It kept going, half laughter and half tears, and she pressed her forehead against his chest for a moment, breathing hard, while Roan held very still and let her, his hands resting light against her back, asking nothing. "Ask me properly," she said finally, muffled, into his coat. Not a council declaration. Ask me." So he did. He drew back just far enough to look at her, and he asked simply, without any of the formal language a king's bonding was supposed to involve. None of the witnesses or ceremony. Just the cold morning air and the broken oak and the first hesitant birdsong of a forest beginning, slowly, to recover from a storm. "Wren, will you stay? Not because anyone requires it of you, not the council, not the kingdom, not even me, if the answer is no. Just because you want to. Because, for the first time in your life, it's entirely up to you, and I would very much like the answer to be yes." "Yes," Wren said, before he'd even finished. And then, laughing again, "Yes, Roan, yes, the bonding, when it happened, properly, formally, weeks later, with Mother Yu hovering anxiously nearby, and Hale standing at a respectful distance, wearing the closest thing to a smile Roan had ever seen on the man's face, was a quiet thing. By the standards of royal ceremonies. No grand hall, no foreign dignitaries. Just the garden, because Wren had asked for the garden, and the late roses, and the particular golden hour of light that fell across the beds in early evening. The bond itself, when it settled, that deep, wordless thread that an Alpha and Omega carried between them once it was made, a sense of each other that didn't need eyes or distance to work, felt to Roan less like gaining something new and more like a held breath, finally released. He felt Wren's presence settle into the edges of his awareness like warmth returning to a cold room, and from the soft, astonished sound she made, low against his shoulder, he understood she felt something of the same. The hollow wood healed slowly, the way forests do. The fallen oak was never cleared. Wren wouldn't allow it, when Roan offered, half joking, to have it hauled away. Instead, the following spring, she had cuttings from the castle gardens planted around its broken trunk, climbing roses, mostly, the same late-blooming variety she'd been pruning the first afternoon Roan sat too long on that garden wall. By the second spring, the roses had taken hold of the dead oak entirely, climbing its gray wood in great unruly drifts of color. so that travelers on the eastern road sometimes stopped to admire what looked, from a distance, like a fallen tree somehow still in bloom. Few of them ever learned the story behind it. The Queen of Vairmore, small, quiet, with dirt permanently under her fingernails and a habit of disappearing into the gardens for hours at a time, much to the despair of the court tailors who could never keep her hymns clean, was not given to telling it, and the king, when occasionally pressed by some visiting dignitary curious about the odd little rose-covered ruin near the eastern ridge, tended only to smile and say that his queen had a fondness for things other people had given up on, and that the hollow wood had simply been the first of many. It was true enough, as far as it went. But Roan, riding past it on quiet mornings, alone now only by choice, never by necessity, because Wren had taken, in the years since, to riding out with him whenever the weather allowed, sometimes thought there was a simpler way to put it. She had been stuck, once, in the wreckage of a storm, certain that whatever came next could only be worse than what had come before. And a man who had ridden out that morning looking for nothing more than a little silence had found, instead, exactly what he hadn't known he was looking for at all. The roses bloomed every spring after that, wild and unplanned and entirely alive, in the place where the storm had once left only wreckage, and that, Roan thought, watching Wren kneel in the grass beside the old fallen oak with her hands full of cuttings and her face turned up laughing, toward the sun, was a far better story than any version the court would ever hear.